Across cultures and historical periods, there is a recurring psychological shift that appears not during chaos, but after order has been secured. Systems stabilize, outcomes become predictable, risk is reduced. Yet beneath this stability, something else begins to thin. Individuals functioning inside highly controlled environments often display diminished tolerance for uncertainty, not immediately, gradually. Stressors that were once absorbed begin to overwhelm. Minor disruptions feel disproportionate. Recovery slows. What emerges is not fragility born of weakness, but fragility produced by control itself. This pattern is rarely identified as such. Control is typically credited with safety, efficiency, and coherence. Its costs appear later, dispersed, delayed, and difficult to attribute. Control has never been solely about domination. Historically, it has been about coordination. Large groups require predictability. Institutions require compliance. Roles require boundaries. From early bureaucratic states to modern organizational systems, control mechanisms were introduced to reduce variance. Rules replaced improvisation. Procedures replaced judgment. Monitoring replaced trust. These systems often succeeded on their own terms. Error rates declined. Output stabilized. Accountability became legible. But psychological systems do not mirror mechanical ones. Where control compresses external variability, it also compresses internal adaptive range. Individuals encounter fewer unpredictable conditions. Their interpretive flexibility narrows. Their capacity to absorb deviation diminishes. This trade-off is rarely acknowledged because it unfolds slowly and because control feels protective while it is being applied. The dominant modern interpretation frames control as resilience building. Structure is assumed to create safety, and safety is assumed to foster strength. This interpretation rests on a partial observation. Controlled environments reduce immediate harm. They limit exposure. They prevent escalation. What is less often acknowledged is that this interpretation was never psychologically complete. It was administratively sufficient. Early psychological models did not treat resilience as insulation. They described it as tolerance developed through managed exposure. Adaptation emerged from encountering variation, not from eliminating it. As institutions scaled, however, exposure was reframed as liability rather than preparation. Variability became inefficiency. Discretion became risk. This reframing did not emerge from psychological consensus. It aligned with administrative reproducibility, legal defensibility, and performance standardization. Control was praised because it worked, within the constraints that selected for it. In highly regulated systems, individuals are rarely required to navigate ambiguity. Decisions are pre-made. Boundaries are explicit. Consequences are predictable. This produces short-term psychological efficiency. Cognitive load decreases. Anxiety often drops. But over time, a substitution occurs. Instead of developing internal adaptive mechanisms, individuals rely on external regulation. Instead of tolerating uncertainty, they avoid it. Instead of recovering from disruption, they escalate it to the system. Resilience shifts location, from the individual to the structure. This relocation is not inherently flawed. It becomes costly when the structure changes, fractures, or withdraws. Mid-20th century military research quietly encountered this limitation. Highly regimented units demonstrated exceptional performance under tightly controlled conditions, yet exhibited disproportionate breakdown when command continuity fractured or operational parameters deviated from training models. The issue was not morale, it was not discipline, it was adaptive range. Units trained with strict compliance outperformed initially, but struggled when improvisation became necessary. Units exposed to controlled variability showed slower standardization, but broader response capacity. These findings complicated doctrine. They were difficult to standardize, difficult to audit, and difficult to scale. As a result, they were largely sidelined, not refuted, but deprioritized. Control persisted because it was easier to replicate. Adaptability was not. The long-term consequence of sustained control is reduced psychological resilience. This reduction does not appear as immediate dysfunction. It manifests as heightened sensitivity to disruption. Smaller stressors trigger larger reactions. Recovery times lengthen. Psychologically, this reflects underused adaptive systems. Coping mechanisms that are not exercised atrophy. Emotional regulation becomes context-dependent rather than internalized. In controlled environments, individuals learn to function when conditions hold. They do not learn to recover when they do not. This produces a paradox. Systems designed to prevent breakdown increase its likelihood under deviation. Institutions often respond by intensifying control, tightening rules, adding oversight, reducing discretion. This response treats the symptom as confirmation of the solution. The cycle reinforces itself. Flexibility is not the absence of structure, it is the capacity to reorganize under strain. Control reduces the need for reorganization. Over time, this capacity weakens. Individuals habituated to predictable environments experience ambiguity as threat rather than variation. They seek restoration of order rather than accommodation of change. This is not a failure of character. It is an adaptation to environment. When control is removed abruptly through institutional change, crisis, or role loss, the psychological cost surfaces. The individual is not unprepared because they lack strength. They are unprepared because strength was never required. Early stress research emphasized hormesis, strengthening through manageable exposure. Later, organizational psychology emphasized safety, predictability, and harm reduction. These frameworks coexist without reconciliation. Where one treats variability as formative, the other treats it as inefficiency. Where one emphasizes tolerance, the other emphasizes prevention. Modern systems often adopt the latter while retaining the language of the former. Resilience is praised rhetorically while being undermined structurally. The contradiction remains intact because resolving it would require accepting costs that cannot be easily administered. Control regulates more than behavior. It stabilizes identity. Roles defined by strict parameters reduce ambiguity about function. Individuals know what is expected, permitted, and rewarded. This clarity is often experienced as coherence, but identity stabilized externally becomes brittle internally. When role boundaries shift, coherence weakens. The individual may experience disorientation not because self-knowledge is absent, but because self-knowledge was outsourced to structure. Control provides identity by reducing choice. Its removal reintroduces choice without preparation. Modern systems frequently attempt to export control-based success into environments that require adaptability. Practices designed for stability are applied to volatility. Metrics replace judgment. Procedures replace situational awareness. This transfer fails because control depends on predictability. When unpredictability increases, controlled systems respond slowly. Their resilience was procedural, not internal. Individuals trained within such systems experience elevated stress during transition, not because they are deficient, but because their adaptive systems were never exercised. The failure is attributed to individual weakness rather than structural over-optimization. Control produces immediate, visible benefits. Its costs are delayed and diffuse. Reduced resilience surfaces later, often during unrelated events. The causal link is obscured by time and complexity. As a result, breakdowns are attributed to circumstance rather than underuse. The response is often more control. The system preserves its logic while deepening its vulnerability. What remains unresolved is not whether control works. It often does. The unresolved tension lies in what control replaces. By reducing exposure, it reduces adaptation. By stabilizing conditions, it destabilizes recovery. By preventing disruption, it trains dependence on continuity. Psychological resilience does not vanish under control. It remains unused. And what remains unused does not remain intact indefinitely. Modern systems continue to pursue control as protection. The cost of that protection unfolds quietly, measured not in immediate failure, but in diminished capacity to withstand what cannot be prevented.